Which president in history do you think is most like Washington in quality, style, result? I mean, those could be different things, but who's kind of Washingtonian in your mind?
Sure. So perhaps unsurprisingly, I think that the presidents who remind me most of Washington are Grant and Eisenhower. They were military men. They had unparalleled reputations when they came into the presidency. So their ability to govern and lead was so unquestioned that they kind of all had a very similar presidential leadership style that I don't necessarily see in other administrations. And they were, of course, all military men. So the way that they conduct themselves, there is sort of, it might sound cliche, but there is sort of that similarity, which I'm now realizing is quite on point given that it's Veterans Day today.
Absolutely. And it is interesting that through Washington's presidency that he's still referred to as general, right? And that's and maybe it's good for the country that civilians followed him immediately in
Yes.
terms of the revolutionaries like Adams and Jefferson.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I mean, and he did work really, really hard to try and make sure that, civilian authority was respected and understood, and he didn't wear his uniform. And I mean, these are really important details, and made sure that when he was seeing troops, he wasn't, doing an official review. Rather, he was just kind of walking by. But yeah, I do think that it was important for the nation that Adams and Jefferson were very distinctly not military men.
Just like the first five presidents that only one of them had a son, right? The namesake of your beautiful dog. Uh,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I also think, while there were a lot of Virginians in that first list, the fact that there weren't all Virginians, I think is important too, because otherwise you might have had a weird state dynasty situation.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so another great question. John Cedillo asks about a possible lesson and kind of thinking about historical connections, and how would you link Washington's cabinet with things like Andrew Jackson's spoils system and then the modern day cabinet, like kind of thinking about the evolution of
Mm.
president's advisors.
Sure. Well, Washington and Jackson's cabinets were basically as opposite as it was possible to have a cabinet be opposite, because Washington convened his cabinet because he wanted to hear from a bunch of different perspectives, and he wanted to get information and ideas that he didn't already have. He was very comfortable knowing his strengths and his weaknesses, and so he was okay with asking people for help. Whereas Jackson essentially went through three cabinets before he could find a group of yes men who would do whatever he told them to do and wouldn't fight back on his various policies. So that approach to the cabinet is like, completely 180. I think um, we've sort of settled on a little bit of a system that's maybe a little bit in the middle, where most presidents recognize that the cabinet is a really good opportunity to bring in other voices that represent different types of American experiences, because the country is so big and diverse that no one person can understand every single walk of life that makes up the American experience. And so the cabinet is a great way to bring in some of those other ideas and those perspectives. And most presidents have generally followed that model. Of course, our definition of diversity has expanded greatly since 1790, but nonetheless, most have followed that model. However, while it's not really an official spoil system, because we do have a lot of civil servants that are not political and who do stay in office from administration to administration and provide really important institutional knowledge, right now in DC, there is a scramble to figure out who's going to get the jobs and who's going to get the positions and who's going to be appointed. And of course, they have to be, well, they usually have to be experienced enough and qualified, but people are looking for some return on their investment from the campaign and from supporting the president-elect.
And so that's interesting about Jackson. And so the spoils system is really the civil servants that he politicized really for the first time in terms of wanting, his own people. And it's interesting that his cabinet kind of had the same idea of people that, would follow him. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cabinet system is, or Jackson's cabinet in particular, is so fascinating because it was just such a mess. It was such a mess. It makes for good reading, though.
very good. And you mentioned the present day and what's happening. And I know you're writing a lot of pieces. You're in great demand right now because of your expertise on the presidency and the cabinet. And you've written a couple of pieces. Do you want to share where you?
Yeah, sure. I'll put a link to, I have all of my editorials on a page on my website, so I'll drop those in the chat right now. But
Great.
the transitions are such a huge moment for our country. So I've taken a look at a couple of different historical precedents and understanding where they come from. So today I had one about why diversity is actually really important in the cabinet and why it makes presidents better, and how President-elect Biden has the opportunity to actually break some glass ceilings. There are some positions that have never had a woman or a person of color. There's never been an openly gay Senate-approved cabinet person. So Pete Buttigieg has been talked about as either a UN ambassador or potentially a Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and that would be precedent setting. So that was today's subject. Yesterday's subject was the history of Senate confirmations of cabinet appointees and whether or not Mitch McConnell's potential rejections of Senates is sort of unprecedented. And sort of spoiler alert on that one, there have only been 9 appointees that have been rejected by the Senate in 230 years. So it's a pretty rare activity. And then over the weekend, I did one on all the potential dangers of the lame duck system in the presidency. So it's been a busy time. Good stuff, but a busy time.
Well, we're lucky to have you. Okay, so the next question is a total hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine the possibility in which a president someday, we don't know this president's name, this president might not concede. What would be sort of George Washington's response to that? And what, I guess more generally, do you want to talk about his transfer of power and how that worked with John Adams in 1797?
Yeah, so I think that transition is often overshadowed by the transition from Adams to Jefferson, but was equally as important because the country had never conducted a peaceful transfer of power before. And 18th century Americans were accustomed to transfers of power usually being accompanied by death, war, revolution, the guillotine, etc. So they were usually quite bloody and dramatic spectacles. They were obviously trying to avoid that scene. And Adams was aware that most Americans were very nervous about this process and worked really hard to provide some institutional stability and continuity and retain that knowledge. Now, that ended up being a spectacular disaster because the cabinet secretaries were very loyal to Hamilton and not to the office of the presidency. These were the secretaries that I mentioned in the B team that Adams retained. But Washington also set up this system. He understood that if he died in office, that was going to make it a much more dramatic transition. And that was going to maybe be spur of the moment because you often can't plan your death and you can't predict it. And so he wanted there to be time for there to be an election, for there to be a handoff of power. I mean, he was also tired and he wanted to go home, but he talked about the importance of having a planned transition and having there be thought and thoughtful consideration about how that process would go. So it was very intentional. And Adams retained that same sort of sensibility when he lost. He didn't attend Jefferson's inauguration, and he was definitely bitter, but he didn't try and interfere in Congress when he could have to cause some serious hijinks. He recognized that he lost, he handed over power, and he left because a peaceful transition of power is central to a republic. If you get military involved, if you get force involved, it is no longer a republic. It is either an oligarchy, it is anarchy, it is a monarchy, it is something, but it is not a republic. And so if Washington were to see a president refuse to participate in that process, he would be horrified, because that is not little r Republican behavior.
Yeah, and I like what you said about the transfer to Adams. I think that people do take it for granted because, it was Washington's vice president, but that was just by the chance of the way the Electoral College worked at the time. They weren't particularly close. If we think about the image that you put up, that great image of the cabinet from the 19th century, it's hard to imagine any group of men less likely to have a cabinet rap battle than those guys, right? But Adams is not in the picture, right? He's not even part of the cabinet. And so that really did matter. And I think with Washington's presidencies, we can think of all the things that could have gone wrong.
Yeah.
Like you said, if he hadn't stepped down at all and still would have died in December of 1799.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Is it a presidency for life?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and there were 3 times in his presidency where he was incredibly ill and doctors weren't sure if he was going to make it. And all 3 of those times were so nerve-wracking because there hadn't ever been that transition. So there wasn't any security about what would happen next.
Yeah. Well, terrific. I could talk to you all night about all this stuff, but we got documents.